So this first video on absolute value equations is going to be a pretty quick one. I just first want to introduce and I suppose remind you of exactly what absolute value means, and then we're just going to quickly talk about evaluating expressions that have absolute values. Okay, so one of the definitions that you should have is from absolute value. So I'm just going to give you kind of a little picture of what absolute values should look like. Okay, so let's say, for instance, that you have the absolute value of a number x. Okay, so what that represents is the distance. It's the distance from 0 on a number line. Sorry, I'm like writing on the edge of a notebook. That's really sloppy. The distance of x from 0 on a number line. So just to give you a little visual aid, let's draw a number line. We'll start with 0 in the middle. And so you're going to have a number up here that, let's say, is a positive x, and then you'd have a number down here that's a negative x. And so absolute value of x, you could get either the positive number or the negative number. And that's because this distance right here is x units away from 0 to the right, which is kind of the answer you expect to see. But then this number is x units from 0 to the left. So say you did like the absolute value of 4, that's positive 4, but then the absolute value of negative 4 is also positive 4 because that's the distance. So negative x is x units away from 0, and positive x is x units away from 0. So the absolute value of positive x would be x. The absolute value of negative x would also be x. So that's why when you're dealing with absolute value, you end up with like a positive version and a negative version. So let's start just with some quick examples right here. Whoops, I think this is where I meant to draw that little picture, so I apologize now for the awkward gap. So let's just write a little example there. So say, for instance, you're trying to take the absolute value of 6. Well, 6 is 6 units from 0 over to the right. So you'd say that it is 6 units away from 0 on a number line. Whereas if you're trying to take the absolute value of negative 6, if you were to count negative 6 from 0, it would be 6 units to the left of 0. So it doesn't matter whether it's to the right or it's to the left. When you take the absolute value, you're strictly talking about distance, and distance doesn't have a sign. It's always positive. So really quickly, let's look at this evaluating example. So this one, we're just going to be taking this expression right here and then subbing in a value for x. So we did this in section 1.1, where we are plugging in different values of variables into the expressions. So we're going to sub in x equals 4 and then simplify this down. So 2.7 plus, and then inside the absolute values, we have 6 minus 2, but then instead of the x, we're going to sub in a 4. Okay, so this actually is really similar to section 1.1 because we're doing an order of operations sort of thing. So remember, the first step, we called it grouping symbols instead of parentheses, because grouping symbols could be a ton of different things. Absolute value symbols count as grouping symbols. So we look inside the absolute value first, and then within the absolute value, we still keep the order of operations. So the very first thing that happens is this multiplication. So 2 times 4, we get 8. So keep everything the same except for the 8. And then inside the absolute value, we're still in there because we're still doing the grouping expressions. I'm sorry, grouping symbols. We do the subtraction next. So 6 minus 8, we come up with negative 2. And then we take the absolute value. So when we're trying to figure out the distance of negative 2 from 0, negative 2 is 2 units away from 0. So the absolute value is 2. And then we just add that. And so we end up with 4.7. So this was just a very quick intro video just talking about expressions. And the next one we'll talk about equations.